Greetings. This Unit 1 that's going to be covered during your driver training will be Georgia laws that control the safe operations of school buses. A number of the laws will be discussed, and they range anywhere from funding for the buses all the way up to traffic laws. Our objectives are to have an understanding of the laws that govern the operation of school buses in Georgia, to understand the importance of the laws as they apply to the safe operation of a school bus, and to have an understanding of the Georgia Board of Education rules. Performance standards. You should be able to correctly respond to each law that governs the operation of a school bus in Georgia. This unit on laws is lengthy, and it contains information that is directly related to the safe operation of school buses, as well as information that concerns the purchase of buses, insurance, and a number of other concerns. This is an overview of 20 codes. So first of all, let's talk about this numbering system. We're going to be talking about 20 codes, 40 codes, and 160 regulations. So what do these numbers mean? Well, okay, let's go back to a law being passed. The General Assembly votes on an act, passes it, it then goes on to the governor, who will sign it into law. Well, those laws have to be recorded somewhere, they have to be filed somewhere, so attorneys and the powers that be that need to reference them can have a place to go back and reference them. So they're given code numbers of a very broad general area of law, and then broken down into subsections and chapters and paragraphs and those kinds of things. Anything that has a 20 code relates to public education in the state of Georgia. So all of the laws that are passed are going to, relating to public education, get filed under a 20 code. Laws are then regulated by the Department of Education. So 20 code laws relate to public education, and generally those laws are regulated by the Department of Education. You'll also see it referred to as Georgia BOE, which is Board of Education. So either way, it's that division of our government, that agency within our government that regulates that. Another code that we're going to be talking about later is the 40 code. 40 code is the body of law that relates to operating motor vehicles over the roadways. That is usually regulated generally by the Department of Public Safety. Within the Department of Public Safety, you have the Department of Driver Services, DDS. So DDS deals with issuing the licensing. You also have, of course, all the local police jurisdictions, etc. So a school bus is a vehicle operated out on the road. So we have to comply to all of those rules as well. So 40 code relates to traffic laws. We'll be talking about that as a part of Unit 1. And finally, toward the end of this unit, we're going to be talking about the 160 regulations. Those regulations start when the General Assembly passes a law saying the Department of Education is going to promulgate regulations relating to a particular matter. The Department of Education then must do that. They write these rules and regulations as to how we're going to come into compliance. And those regulations are not voted on by the General Assembly, but they have the effect of law. So we will talk about that as well. What you need to know about these numbers is there will be a question we're going to ask you what 40 code means. What is 40 code? 40 code relates to traffic law. That's it. You don't really need to know a lot of the specifics about these numbers. Okay, so let's come back to the 20 codes. Again, 20 codes is relating directly to public education in Georgia and is enforced by the Department of Education, and it includes anything and everything relating to that, including school bus transportation. So, among the things we're going to be talking about here when we talk about the 20 codes will be student transportation. We're going to talk about performance evaluation, salary and leave, terms of employment, and conduct. Continuing on, we're going to talk about bullying, discipline, funding of all things relating to schools that's in that code, but of course specifically we're going to be more interested in school bus purchases and those types of things, insurance, drug testing, training, route scheduling, the disrupting of schools, and electronic communications. Why are the 20 codes important? Well, because it's going to help us understand the laws governing student transportation, understand the laws pertaining to conduct and discipline, understand funding and insurance, understanding terms of employment. Let's start with one of the first codes that we have here. You'll see these numbers, 20-2-188. Again, don't worry about that number. Just 20 code is a part of those regulations enforced by the Department of Education. The first thing we look at in this code that's there is calculation of transportation cost and fund allotment. Now, just as an example of how the law is written, the amount of funds needed by a local unit of administration to pay expenses of student transportation shall be calculated by the State Board of Education in accordance with a schedule of standard transportation costs to be incurred by local units of administration in the operation of economical and efficient student transportation programs, and a schedule of variable transportation costs or variable cost factors dependent upon prevailing circumstances. A couple of terms in here that you see throughout the law. They refer to local unit of administration. Well, that's a local school board. So Fulton County School Board, that's a local unit of administration. DeKalb County, Beaufort City Schools, those are all boards of education. That's what they refer to when they talk about a local unit of administration. Again, the State Board of Education is, in fact, the State Board of Education. And so what did we say here? It just basically says that the state does have formulas for calculating what we're going to do or how much they're going to fund and pay. One of the things to understand with any law that they have, most of these laws will dictate that the local school districts have to do certain things. They may have to purchase buses of a certain specification. They're going to have to pay minimum salaries to their employees, that kind of thing. So with these specifications and minimum requirements comes costs, and it makes sense that if the state is going to dictate that the local school districts do that, they would also provide some funding to offset those costs. The cost of transporting students is partially reimbursed by the state through an information gathering formula. The state then funds the local system for a portion that shall not exceed the actual cost of transportation. Again, that's language from the law. Every so often, the local school districts have to provide to the state information that the state needs to determine how much money they need to give to the local school districts. So there is information that we're required to gather, and some of that ultimately boils down to forms that have to be filled out by the school bus drivers. We give that information up. It is then sent up to the school district. The state can then reimburse us for, usually it is going to just be a part of that. The law says that if the amount of money that they were to give us would actually exceed our actual cost, then it gets capped at the actual cost. It's going to be very rare that the state would be giving us a school district more money than what they actually needed to pay for. It establishes minimum salaries. It dictates a minimum salary that must be paid to bus drivers. That's usually stipulated as a monthly amount. And usually with that minimum stipulation, that really pretty much dictates the amount of dollars that the state will be giving to the local school districts. Most local school districts are going to pay more than what that state dictates as a minimum. Therefore, the local school districts are going to have to provide supplemental funding to pay their actual going hourly rates, etc. It establishes standards for the equipment and supply and service bids. The state itself will oftentimes put out bids for equipment such as school buses. Local school districts can be a part of that and purchase through that. A lot of the larger school districts may try to bid on their own, but again, some of the smaller school districts usually will purchase through the state system. Again, the state does dictate minimum standards, so if a local school district tries to buy buses on their own, for instance, they still have to meet the minimum specifications required by the state. Continuing on with this, mileage limitation for transportation of students. The limitation is basically 1.5 miles. So if students, and I'm talking about regular ed students now, live within 1.5 miles of the school district, the state will not provide reimbursement for the cost of transportation of that student to the school. They only count those that live outside 1.5 miles from the school district. Now, a couple of things about this, and this relates to a lot of these regulations in general. Simply because they will not provide funding for somebody who lives within 1.5 miles of the school district doesn't mean that we can't provide such transportation. And a lot of school districts will have routes where they'll pick up students outside of 1.5 mile radius, but on the way to the school, they'll stop by and pick up other students on the way in there. It doesn't prohibit us from picking up students that are within a mile and a half of the school district, but it does, or of a particular school location, but it does allow us to say that we will not provide that transportation. Again, as a school bus driver, you don't need to know this. It's something that the school district itself has to be concerned about. But if you're running a route and you're wondering why students that live within a certain distance of the school are not being transported, well, this is one of the things that the school district is considering in making those decisions as to which neighborhoods might get picked up and which ones aren't. You're much more likely to see school districts within that mile and a half radius be picked up. Maybe it's dangerous to get to a particular school location, and again, we've got buses going by there anyway, and we'll go ahead and pick them up. But if you're kind of wondering about why we might be picking up some neighborhoods or not some other neighborhoods, it all relates back potentially to funding, and again, our school district choosing to exclude those that would not otherwise be paid for. By the way, for special needs students, there is no mileage restriction. No matter where a special needs student lives relative to the school that they attend, we can pick them up, and that would be funded. The state law provides for minimum standards for the vehicles, the drivers, safety program, and evacuation. Okay, a couple of things that are very common for school districts to do with their drivers is really a part of this law. First of all, the training that you're receiving right now is a part of that. The fact that you're involved in watching this program here, that is the result of the law. Drivers must have a minimum of 12 hours in the classroom. They have to have 31 units of specified curriculum as a part of that classroom training. Again, that's a part of the law. The other thing that school districts do is emergency bus evacuations. Typically, we do 2 of those a year, one in the fall and one of the spring semesters. Again, that is required by law that we do emergency bus evacuations. So that's all a part of the legal stipulation. And another thing that's just in here, transportation for Sapelo Island students. So the State Board of Education shall have the authority to allot funds for the transportation of all public school all public school students residing on Sapelo Island to the mainland of the state for the purpose of attending school on the mainland. Why do we put that in there? It's not going to be a part of the test, but it's to understand that the state of Georgia is very large, it's very complex, there's a lot of issues that we have to look at. There are residents on Sapelo Island that are entitled to a public education. We're not going to build a school building on the island necessarily, so we have to arrange for special transportation arrangements for them to be able to get over and attend a school on the mainland. Continuing on, the law talks about special needs transportation and funding. It talks about funds paid to independent school systems for transportation systems. Generally, independent school systems are going to be public school systems, usually towns. So generally a school system is going to be based upon a county, but then within counties you may have towns or cities that would set up their own school system. So that would be an independent school system. It is a public school system, and again, we still talk about those under the law. The law dictates that a certain amount of money would be allocated to the school districts to provide for sick and personal leave for employees, including drivers. Because that funding is provided, it would also dictate that the local school districts provide sick and personal leave that is paid, at least minimally, some to a degree. A different law now. This is basically 20-2-210. Again, you don't need to be concerned about the numbers, but this law relates to what I would call employee relations matters between a local school district and its employees. So, personnel performance evaluation. The law dictates that all employees of all school districts must be given an annual performance evaluation, and that performance evaluation is maintained in a confidential personnel file. The law used to dictate that those evaluations had to be conducted by April 1st. I'm not sure if that date is still in the code, but nonetheless, all personnel, so from the top down, the superintendent all the way down to whatever, school bus drivers, custodians, cafeteria workers, etc., all employees of the school system must have an annual evaluation, and they must be those evaluations must be maintained in a confidential personnel file. The law talks about terms of employment, and basically full-time employees are going to have an annual contract. Understand this is not like what an athlete would get with a professional team or anything like that. The annual contract basically specifies how many working days there would be in an annual year, in a year for employees, and then it specifies how pay is paid out over the course of a 12-month period of time. So school is taking place during a 9-month period of time, and then during the summer we've got a couple of months off where most employees are not working at all. Again, your pay is based upon typically the 180 or so days that you're actually working during the school year, and then that pay is also then spread out throughout the year, so you're getting paychecks, and therefore you're able to get medical benefits and other things throughout the summer. So that concept is a part of law there. Disqualifying acts would be things that would result in an employee being separated. Job descriptions, again, the law says along with all employees have to have an evaluation. A good evaluation is going to relate to what the nature of the job is and how the employee is doing it, so it makes sense that job descriptions always be a part of that as well. Fingerprinting, you've all been through it by now. The law requires that all employees of all public school districts have fingerprinting done. And as a part of that, a criminal record check is done. The state does not reimburse the school districts for those criminal record checks being done. They require that it be done, but there's no reimbursement for that from the state. So the school districts are on their own to do that, and the law does allow the school districts to pass that cost on to employees at the time of their hire, and that's a very common practice. So the employees have to be fingerprinted and have an extensive criminal background check done before they're actually hired. And again, it's not at all unusual for the employees, those applicants, if you will, to be expected to pay that cost. A few other things in the law, and again, these 4 bullet items here you're not going to be tested on, just kind of for your information. Salary supplements, the state board will provide funding to the local school districts, but most school districts will provide some sort of a supplement to their employees to really boost it up. Again, the amount provided by the state is a minimal amount. Most school districts have to pay more in order to be competitive in the local labor markets. This body of law says that if a school is providing a supplement, they can't cut that supplement because the state is providing more money. So just to give it some simple numbers, if this year the state is giving a bus driver, let's say $50, and the local school district is matching it with another $50, giving another $50, that employee is getting $100. But 50 of that is the supplement from the local school district. If the state decides that they'll give another $10, so next year they give $60, that local school district must still maintain at least that $50 supplement. They can't say, okay, we'll just keep the employee at $100 and pay them only $40 and let the state absorb that other $10. That's not allowed under this provision of the law. Funding, basically what this is talking about is our money comes usually mostly from taxpayer dollars, and there's different taxation sources. Most school districts throughout the state get most of their money from local property taxes, but again, we do get money from state taxes and that kind of thing. So it basically says that these funds have to be maintained properly, accounted for properly, and that the money must be spent in certain ways. And again, all of this accounting must be set up properly. Contract services, it basically allows for all the local school districts to contract out some services. That's not unusual with school buses. Most of the large school districts throughout the state will have their school bus drivers as employees of the school district. But a lot of the smaller school districts throughout the state will have an outside contract service come in and operate it. Some of the larger ones may have some very unique transportation situations that they would contract out as well. So the law does allow for it, but again, those employees are subject to the same stipulation as a regular employee of an actual school district. And this provisions course talks about the provisions with the contracts, leasing arrangements, and those types of things. A couple just a real quick review questions. Do school bus drivers receive sick and personal leave? The answer is yes, we do. Again, the law dictates that that must be provided, paid leave must be provided under certain circumstances, and along with that, they provide some funding to reimburse the local school districts for that. How often are bus drivers evaluated? Every year, once a year. Are bus drivers required to be fingerprinted and have a background check? Absolutely. Why? It is required by law, and it is a safety issue. And generally what they're looking for are convictions related to children, etc. So you don't have to have a sparkling clean record by any means, but again, there are certain types of things that would preclude a school district from hiring an employee. Any convictions relating to children certainly would disqualify somebody. Okay, moving on. Different body of law here, 20-2-751 talks about bullying. The law prohibits bullying. It talks about assignment to alternative schools. Okay, bullying. There is a law dedicated to that subject alone. The law says that we must affirmatively prohibit it. It says that students who may be involved with bullying must be assigned to an alternative school, and it provides for that. And it also does say that we have to have a notice of prohibition of that all students must be fully aware of it. Bullying is defined within the law. It is any willful attempt or threat to inflict injury on another person when accompanied by an apparent present ability to do so, or any intentional display of force such as would give the victim reason or to fear or expect immediate bodily harm. So it's really two parts. By the way, eventually you might see a multiple choice question that kind of tacks on something along the lines of an intentional omission from social events, deliberately excluding people from social events. For the purpose of that question, we're going to include that in the definition of as well. So let's just review this. Any willful attempt or a threat to inflict injury, any intentional display of force that would give the victim reason to fear, and again, we kind of tack on another thing there, which is deliberate exclusion from social activity. Those would come into the definition of bullying. That last part, again, for the purpose of our questions, we're going to say that that is a part of it. What do you need to know about as a school bus driver? Again, you're not expected to understand the law. What is important is that we do have people within the school district that do understand the definition of the law. It's very important they do that, because if somebody is actually guilty of bullying, there can be very serious ramifications to that individual. So we don't want to cause harm to somebody who is falsely accused. The flip side of the coin, though, as you can understand, is that somebody who is the victim of a bullying can be very much affected. They're going to be unable to focus and learn while in school, and it can affect them really in other aspects of their social life and their emotional growth and development as well. So this is a very big deal. It's a big issue. That's why we have a law dedicated to it. Again, we don't expect you to be an expert in defining what bullying is or what it isn't, but you need to be able to observe your students, and if you see a student who is being mean to other students, you need to let your supervisor know. We need to pass that on to the school district. We need to give the local school officials the opportunity to take a look at what this is. Even if it's not bullying, we are concerned, the school districts are concerned about all students' behavior and how they relate to others. And so we're going to allow those experts to be able to be aware of the situation and deal with it as they see fit. So again, as a bus driver, what you're looking out for is making sure that all your students behave properly, behave nicely, and in a civil manner toward each other. And if you've got somebody who is routinely being aggressive, especially if they're focusing on particular individuals, that kind of behavior needs to be reported to the local school. The law talks about student codes of conduct, and so the Student Code of Conduct is a publication that the school districts must produce. And the law says that there are certain subjects that have to be in there. In fact, the law has language in there that is typically just taken by all the local school districts and put right into the Code of Conduct. Among the things that are in that Code of Conduct that must be included in that publication are safety rules on the school buses. The law also says that the codes of conduct must be distributed, and there must be an acknowledgement of the receipt of that distribution as well. All students must be given a code of conduct. Part of that code of conduct outlines not only what expected behavior is, but then what the ramification would be, the disciplinary procedures for somebody who violates some of the rules within that code of conduct. And again, does require that they are distributed and receipts are brought back. So the school district has to prove that the parents of the students were given a copy of it and given the opportunity to read, ask any questions, and that kind of thing. Disciplinary policy. There are policies for any acts of violence against teachers, school bus drivers, and other school officials or employees. So again, in the law, it says that it is essentially illegal for primarily it focuses on students to engage in an act of violence against teachers, school bus drivers, or any school officials or employees. Simply put, a student cannot physically attack an employee of the school system. That is specified as a part of the code of conduct that they're given, and again, any student that violates that would be subject to rather significant disciplinary procedures as a result of doing that. Other provisions in the law, there's maternity leave provisions, transportation contracts, financial interest specifications. Again, there's not going to be any questions on this. We just put this up there. We do want you to understand that there's a lot of things in this law that kind of regulates, again, employee relations, certain things that benefits, compensation, that kind of thing that school districts must provide for its employees. There's also a lot of regulations to the school districts as to how they account for funds that are spent, what funds are legitimate, what funds aren't, etc. Transportation that is forbidden, anything that is detrimental to the student's health, and there are penalty provisions for that. Again, I'm reading the law here. It says, it shall be unlawful to transport any student to or from any public school in this state if a physician licensed to practice medicine in this state shall have certified to the superintendent of the county or independent school system in writing that the transportation of such student would be detrimental to the health of the student. It shall be unlawful to expend or use public funds for the transportation of students for whom a certificate has been filed by the physician. Any person, school superintendent, or member of the county or independent school board violating this code shall be guilty of a misdemeanor. Again, this is a very specific point. It says that if somebody is certified by a physician that they are not to ride a school bus because it would be detrimental to that student's health, then obviously we're not going to provide transportation to them. And why would we want to? Again, that is specifically prohibited, however. And again, this is just one of many, many regulations that are out there that the management of a transportation department has to be aware of to make sure that we are providing the transportation required by law without providing transportation that would be contrary to the law. What you need to know as a school bus driver is you do what you're told to do. Drive the routes that have been assigned to you by the transportation department. Funded transportation, some other examples, there's transportation for elderly, transportation for persons with disabilities, specifically transportation allowed for 4-H activities. We do allow some funding for some recreational activities and of course, educational activities. Again, reading from the law here, county and independent school systems may use school buses to provide transportation to students and others to attend summer camps or to participate in other recreational or educational activities if the cost of such transportation and of any additional insurance costs deemed reasonably necessary by the school system are reimbursed in full from public or private funds other than public schools funds. Especially, and again, this is another funding source, we might get federal money to pay for certain types of programs, etc. So we can perhaps expand outside there. Once again, what's your takeaway as a school bus driver? If the transportation department gives you an assignment, it's legal, okay? You can go ahead and drive the bus and transport those people that we specify on the trip that we specify, and you will be paid to do that. Do not try to use the bus for personal reasons. Don't try to strike a deal with a local coach or a teacher or somebody else. Any type of transportation that has not been authorized by the Transportation Department is not to be done. It puts the school district in jeopardy. You've got insurance issues, funding issues, et cetera, et cetera. Speaking of insurance, and I'm not going to go through all the different issues here, but there are different types of insurance. We have to have insurance for the vehicles themselves. We have to have insurance for damage caused to other property. We have to have, of course, insurance for the well-being of the drivers, workers' compensation for the driver, other insurance for students in case they get injured, et cetera, et cetera. So all different types of insurance that are required by law there. And there's policy retention requirements, of course, for all that insurance as well. Again, you're not going to be tested on whether or not we need to have insurance. It's not your job as a driver to be concerned about that. The school district is going to have that to protect its assets. Okay, what is bullying? Any willful attempt or threat to inflict injury on another person, along with any intentional display of force, such as would give the victim reason to fear or expect immediate bodily harm. And again, if you're asked this multiple choice question later, we will also tack on to that, deliberately excluding somebody from a social event. Okay, question, can a student be charged for physical violence against a bus driver? Absolutely. Any student alleged to have committed any act of physical violence shall be suspended pending the hearing by the disciplinary hearing officer, panel, or tribunal. And again, this can result in criminal charges, but the key thing is we're certainly going to take a student who has been involved with that type of behavior and at least get them out of the regular school district for a while until we can determine that it is safe for them to resume. Name a form of funded transportation. Again, we've got elderly persons with disabilities and 4-H activities. Again, there's not going to be any questions relating to what is funded transportation or what isn't, so don't be too concerned about that. Like I said, the takeaway for you is accept only those trips that have been given to you by the Transportation Department. You should not be accepting any trip outside of that. Sick leave, again, the law requires sick leave with pay, and it requires the accumulation of unused sick leave. So once again, if it's dictated by law that you provide it, there will be some funding associated with it. If there's funding associated with it, then it's going to be required. Okay, so all school districts, all full-time employees are going to have some level of sick leave available to them. If at the end of a contract year that leave is not used up, then it accumulates and rolls over to the next year. Unused sick leave is not paid at the time of separation necessarily. That would be up to a local school district. But the state does require that some income maintenance benefit be provided, some basic income insurance really is what this is, be provided to the employees, and again, any unused stuff, any unused time is rolled up to the next year. Personal leave, it just simply says that of all of the sick leave that's given at the beginning of the year, at least 3 of those sick leave days may be used for personal reasons. So simply put, the first 3 days of sick time you accumulate, you can use it for personal time. If you don't use the personal leave, it rolls over as sick time. So personal days do not accumulate, sick time does. Pay for substitute drivers and pay scale for substitutes, again, that's provided in there. Minimum payments to be made and funding that is provided from the state. Drug testing, you've all been through this. In order to get hired, but there's other provisions for drug testing as well. So school bus drivers, well, let me just go in. Again, I'm going to read from the law. The law provides that drug testing must be done. It provides for when it must be done. It provides for penalty for violation and refusal to submit to the test. Now, the drug testing for school bus drivers is required actually by federal law. So the real issue comes back to the school districts as to what do we do, given that they have to be tested under the federal law. How do we handle somebody who fails the drug test? So that's really the question that comes back to us. Any school bus driver found to have used an illegal drug shall be terminated from his or her employment. That is the state law as to how we're going to deal with somebody who uses illegal drugs. School bus driver found to have any measurable alcohol in his or her system during the school day shall be subject to disciplinary action at the discretion of the local board of education. So the law there does not dictate, you'll notice when it comes to alcohol, it does not dictate that the employee be fired. It also says that it is up to the local school district. And I think most school districts, if they find a school bus driver test positive for alcohol, will most likely separate that employee. But understand the difference between testing positive for illegal drugs and testing positive for alcohol by law is that employees who test positive for illegal drugs must be fired. They must be terminated. Employees who test positive for alcohol, again, that the local school districts have more discretion there. It goes on to say what happens, the question is what happens if somebody refuses to even submit to a test, and the law says that a school bus driver who refuses to provide body fluid when requested to do so in accordance with drug testing or random alcohol testing conducted pursuant to this part and rules of the regulations promulgated under this part shall be terminated from employment. So if somebody refuses to take a breath test or refuses to take a drug test, then they must be terminated in accordance to the law. Again, you see the differences between the illegal drugs and the alcohol, and again, refusal of test. Body fluid, by the way, would be anything emitted from the body. So we think of it as urine because it's liquid, but actually your breath is considered fluid as well. So anybody who refuses to submit to either a urine test for drugs or a breath test for alcohol under the law must be separated. Okay, mandatory training. I've alluded to this before, but again, it's in the code. This is the annual training for school bus drivers. We must be given annual training by a representative of the State Department of Education on traffic laws, bus operations, and safety. And that is done once a year. Most school districts will have that done in the first semester, and probably most school districts will try to get that done even before the first semester starts. The State Board of Education has transportation specialists as a part of the agency. They gather information throughout the previous years. These folks are also in tune to what's going on nationally. And again, they bring together a program that they present. It's an excellent program that lets you know, among other things, what accidents happened, severe accidents happened in the previous school year in the state of Georgia, the types of things that we need to focus on, any changes in the laws, new regulations, etc. Written policies and procedures. This is, again, something that goes back to the students. It has to be, this really relates to the code of conduct. Again, you've got written policies and procedures in there. The school districts might have something that goes above and beyond the minimum code of conduct required by the state, but anything that's put out there must be acknowledged by the students, and really more specifically, there has to be an acknowledgement by the parent or guardian, and there must be some way of filing that and proving that they have received them. Route scheduling. We are required to post the route time with public access. So what most school districts are now doing is taking advantage of software that allows them to post route information on the school's website. So somebody can go in there typically and put in their address and find out what bus will be coming by to pick up at what location and at what time. But anyway, this information has to be put out there so that the public does have access to it. Again, the start time for the school is included as a part of that information, and again, specifically the route time as well. A lot of times it can be a little bit more simpler. All they have to do is say the start time of the route, the first pickup, the number of stops that are along the route, and then the anticipated time that they must be to the school. Exemptions would be portal-to-portal transportation, so that's special needs, and that is what we know as portal-to-portal. We pick them up typically at the driveway of the student's house, at the entrance perhaps to an apartment complex, whatever. We get right close to where that student is located, and we transport them directly to the school in the morning, and then, of course, in the afternoon we bring them back. Those routes are not required by law to be published because it's very, very specifically oriented to individuals. And anytime a student comes off that and another student is added, those things have to change. So there's no requirement on portal-to-portal transportation to have that publicly published. School zones. The law specifies what a school zone is and typically specifies the reduction in speed traffic and when the school zone is in effect. So as you're driving down a road where a school is located, the regular posted speed limit might be 40 miles an hour, but it's probably going to drop down to about 25 miles an hour near the school during certain times of the day. So that's what we're talking about here with the school zone safety. It's not unusual to find within the school zone a school crossing guard. Key thing there is that the crossing guards are there to protect pedestrians. They're not there to enable the smooth flow of traffic necessarily. They are there to stop traffic and protect pedestrians. And by the way, school crossing guards will oftentimes be posted as buses come out onto the main roads. Again, if you have a school crossing guard there, their primary responsibility is the pedestrians that are crossing at that location, not necessarily making it easy on the school buses. Disrupting of the school, there is a penalty for anybody who disrupts the school environment, but do understand that the school bus itself and a school bus stop is included in that. So let me just again read from the law here. It shall be unlawful for any person to disrupt or interfere with the operation of any public school bus, or public school bus stop as designated by local school boards of education. Any person violating this code section will be guilty of a misdemeanor of a high and aggravated nature. What's your takeaway here? The common example would be typically in the morning. It may happen in the afternoon as well, but a parent will try to step up on the bus and they want to know which student was messing around with their child on the previous trip. So what you have is a very angry parent who wants immediate justice right then and there. That is interfering with the school bus operation. So it's that type of behavior, as an example, that would actually be illegal under this law. What should you do? Well, first of all, as best you can, try to keep them from boarding the bus. Don't slam the door in their face or get them caught in the door, but try to caution them not to even board the bus in the first place. Whether they board the bus or not, understand that they've got information that was provided to them by their child, and that information is probably not accurate, but the parent thinks that it is. So if what they thought was true really was true, you'd probably be upset too. The problem is it's probably not true. Anyway, they're very upset. So you need to take time to understand that they're upset, and you need to find a way to calmly and effectively enable them to address that issue. So what you tell them is, I'm sorry, I have to run this route on a specified time frame, so this is not really the best time and place for me to deal with this. We also have students here that are, we don't want them to hear this discussion and that kind of thing. Please call the school. If you will call the school, then they will contact my supervisor, we'll do the investigation, we'll get to this, we'll go ahead and do that. But I have to move on. I have to continue on the route as quickly and as safely and as efficiently as I can. So that's what you need to do. Now, if the parent persists, you tell them, I'm sorry, I do have to move on, and you're actually in violation of the law by preventing me from doing this. And if you don't step down off the bus, I will have to call dispatch, and they may have to send police out. Usually you don't get to that point. On those rare occasions, if you ever do get to that point, when you tell them, yes, this is the law and you must step down and step away so that you can proceed on, usually at that point they'll do that. It is extremely rare that we actually have to call police out to a school bus stop. And I want to tell you that it's extremely rare that there's even any of that type of disruption, but it does happen on occasion. So it is illegal for that type of activity to do that. Again, we're not interested in calling the police at every opportunity we have and have people arrested and prosecuted. We just want them to, let's understand why they're upset, and let's give them an effective way of dealing with that. And the effective way of dealing with that is to call the school itself. If you have a little card that has your supervisor's name and phone number on it that's convenient, you can also provide that to them. Certainly just give them an opportunity to call somebody, express their current concerns. And the reality is that these concerns will be addressed. We will look into these matters and pursue them. Abuse of school employees. If somebody gets on the bus in the presence of students and uses profanity, then or engages in any other types of threats or abuse against the school employee, they are in violation of this law. It is considered a misdemeanor and punishable by a fine up to $500. Electronic communication. Now, in a later law, we're going to talk about the driver's use of electronic communication. For right now, for this purpose, we're talking about students using cell phones on a school bus. So the policy is set by the local Board of Education. Again, this is in the Student Code of Conduct. This is one of the things that must be talked about in the Student Code of Conduct. What most school districts do is they take the language that's in the state law and just put that in their Code of Conduct. Generally, the possession of an electronic communication device by a student in the school shall be permitted or prohibited as specifically prescribed by the rule of that school district. To you, it's important that you're aware of what the school district policy is. The law does say that the use of electronic communication equipment is prohibited if it interferes with the equipment installed on the bus. That is typically not going to be an issue anymore. Our technologies are advanced enough that we don't have to have interference. Generally, the school board is not going to prohibit the possession of these devices. They're really going to not prohibit the use of them outright, because an outright ban of the use of these devices is just simply not practical. So what we are going to do is we're going to focus on proper, courteous, and safe use of the equipment. So if a child is trying to sit right behind a school bus driver and talk on a cell phone, that conversation is going to be heard by the driver. It's going to be a distraction to the driver. So generally what we're going to say is they should not be engaging in phone conversation while on the bus, because even though it doesn't interfere with our equipment, it does create a distraction and can potentially create a safety problem. So that's what you want to do. You want to focus on the safe and courteous use of these devices, and not so much think in terms of a total ban on the use of them. Some study questions on this most recent material we've reviewed. Are school bus drivers subject to random drug testing? The answer to that is yes, and I realize that I didn't talk about the areas of testing that can take place. Again, this is really dictated by federal law. You must be tested on a pre-employment basis. You are subject to random drug testing. You are subject to post-accident testing under certain circumstances, and you're subject to drug testing if there is reasonable suspicion to believe that you may have been using drugs. The person who would make that judgment is somebody who is supposed to have been trained on recognizing drug and alcohol usage. So those are generally the four areas where you may be tested: pre-employment, random, post-accident, and reasonable suspicion. So yes, drivers certainly are subject to random drug testing. It is a safety-sensitive job, and because you hold a commercial driver's license, federal regulations require that testing. Why do you have mandatory state training? So the driver's going to be familiar with the operation of the school buses and school bus safety. And again, what you're having right now in your initial training, this 12 hours and the 31 units, that's mandated by the state, but then there's also going to be an annual training that is also mandated by the state to make sure that we're updated on current information, techniques, procedures, issues, etc. Why is it required to run the route the same way every day? Well, to be consistent and to meet the requirements as prescribed by law. There's a variety of reasons to run it the same way every day, a variety of very practical reasons to do it. The law does require, again, that we publish and post information about the routes A lot of school districts get very specific with actual times for specific pickup locations. Again, you want to be consistent as a courtesy to that. Again, the law requires that to the extent that we can, we always are going to want to run the route the same way as it's prescribed by the school district to be run. Why do you run it the same way every day? To be consistent and to meet requirements as prescribed by the law. Is it unlawful to interrupt or interfere with the operation of a school bus? Absolutely. The summary of these Georgia laws of school bus operation. So again, the summary of these laws coming from the Department of Education as they're enforced by the Department of Education. Again, we go into student transportation. We talk about employee performance review, employee salary and leave, terms of employment for the employees. Again, that's where the annual contract comes into play. Conduct not only of the students but also of employees. There is a definition and ramifications and prescribed discipline, et cetera, for bullying. Again, if you have any reason to believe that bullying may take place, it's not your job to decide whether or not somebody is actually in violation of the law. Your job is to just simply report what you suspect as mean behavior. You want to describe to the people what it is that you've actually seen. And again, we'll allow the school officials to do the investigation and make the determination of whether or not it's bullying. Disciplinary procedures for students, funding, insurance, drug testing. Again, federal law dictates that it must be done under certain circumstances. Where the state comes in is what are we going to do in case somebody either refuses to submit to a test or if they test positive for drugs or alcohol. So that's provided in there by law. Again, the training of drivers, route scheduling, what happens to those that disrupt the operations of the school bus. And again, we've talked about electronic communication as well. Now, we're going to go on to the 40 code. As I mentioned before, you don't need to worry about numbers much. There's only one thing you need to understand. 40 code relates to Georgia traffic laws. That's the question asked, true or false, 40 code relates to traffic laws. Yes, it's traffic laws. This is enforced by the local police primarily. So these are traffic laws enforced by local police. Included, though, also in the 40 code is licensing requirements. So that is administered by the Department of Driver Services. And both police and Department of Driver Services fall under the general agency of the Public Safety. The Georgia Department of Public Safety is the umbrella agency over all of these other smaller agencies. Overview of 40 codes. It does talk about state vehicle registration. School buses are a vehicle. They're government owned, so we don't have to spend a lot of money to register our vehicles, but nonetheless they have to have tags on the back of them just like any other vehicle would have. 40 codes dictate, again, licensing requirements, and again, school buses, most school bus drivers are going to have a commercial driver's license. Talks about the laws on railroad crossings, speed limits, headlights, and visual signals specifically for school buses, reporting violations of people who run stop arms, the operation of the school bus, standard equipment required, special route services, unlawful acts, and inspection and penalties. Why are they important? To understand the license requirements, to understand traffic laws, to understand school bus operation, and to understand penalty for violations. Okay, we start with definitions. All laws have to have definitions. If something's going to be illegal, we have to define what it is that's illegal. If something is going to be required, we have to define what it is by requirement. So all laws, when they're written, typically have a list of of definitions of what it is that we're trying to regulate, and that includes school buses. So a school bus is a motor vehicle used to transport students to and from school, and it must meet equipment and identification standards. Let me read a part of the law here on this definition. A motor vehicle operated for the transportation of school children to and from school or school activities. That's the definition of a school bus generally. Such terms shall not include a motor vehicle with a capacity of 15 persons or less operated for the transportation of school children to or from school activities. If a vehicle transports less than 14 passengers, 14 or fewer passengers plus the driver. That would be a total of 15 or less. Those types of small vehicles technically do not fall under the definition of a school bus. They're exempted from this definition. Therefore, the licensing requirements of having a commercial driver's license, etc., would not apply as well. So that's an important exemption. School systems may use that to allow certain types of activities to be driven. They'll allow teachers to drive a small group of students using these smaller vehicles. They would not be required to have the commercial driver's license in order to do that. We're still going to want to take them through the state training, the 12 hours of classroom, et cetera, but they're not necessarily required to have a CDL. So there is that exemption if a vehicle is a relatively small vehicle, even though it may be used to drive students around to activities, et cetera. It would not necessarily be a school bus, and it therefore has an exemption. Generally, the school buses are going to have equipment specifications. So the yellow on the school bus is actually dictated. It's a national standard. It's a National School Bus Chrome Yellow. That color is there. Of course, the loading lights, the crossing gate, the stop arm, and those kinds of things. That equipment is required to be used when you're picking up students out in the neighborhood or dropping them off in the neighborhood. That equipment is not necessarily necessary to be used. It does not necessarily have to be on a vehicle if that vehicle is just going from one parking lot to another. So if you're taking the debate team from one high school to another high school, again, you don't need to be operating that equipment, so the bus would not necessarily have to have that on there. Most school buses are going to have all the equipment necessary, and again, we're going to make sure that most school bus drivers are going to have the commercial driver's license and be able to operate any of that equipment under any circumstances. State vehicles, it basically requires registration and licensing of those vehicles. Again, school buses are a vehicle out on the road, so they must comply to that requirement. All right, 40 Code is going to talk about issuance of CDL licenses. It talks about the age requirements, which is 18. You must be a minimum of age 18. Our school buses, most school buses will transport more than 14 passengers, so with it's going to be 15 or more passengers, included the drivers. That means it's going to have 16 or more people on that bus. As a result, you need the P endorsement on there. You'll need the S endorsement, the school bus endorsement. Many of the larger buses have air brake systems, so if they do come equipped with air brakes, you need to take the air brake test as well. So these are knowledge tests. The knowledge tests are those written tests that you take at the Department of Driver Services office in order to get your permit. And it can be up to 4 parts. General knowledge is required of everybody. Generally, passenger and school bus is going to be required. And again, if you're driving with a system that has a lot of vehicles with air brakes, you're going to get the air brake test as well. So typically 4-part knowledge test must be passed. And then once you get the permit, you then have to take a hands-on test known as the skills test. The skills test has 3 parts to it. It has the pre-trip. You must pass the pre-trip first before you go on to the next part, which is basic skills, commonly known as the range. And then you must pass that in order to go out for the third part, which is the over-the-road part of the test. So the skills test is a 3-part test that must be passed in order for you to get your license. The state regulates third-party testing. So, of course, you can go to the Department of Driver Services, and they will have somebody that will actually administer the skills test, but they don't have a lot of those folks, and you've got to schedule it, and that's not the most convenient thing. So a lot of the larger school districts that are hiring a lot of bus drivers over the course of the year, they will take advantage of a provision in the law and in the system that allows employees of those school districts to be certified to administer those third-party tests. So a lot of school districts have that as well. When that person is administering the test, they are representing the Department of Driver Services. They must perform that test in accordance to the specifications necessary and required by the Department of Driver Services. So they may be an employee of the school district, but again, they're representing the Department of Driver Services when they administer those tests. The instructional permit, again, is required before you can take the skills test. And in order to get the instructional permit, you must pass knowledge tests, the appropriate knowledge tests. Contents of the license, it talks about the classification. For most school buses, you must have a minimum of a Class B. By the way, Class C is a regular car, so Class B is going to be a single vehicle as opposed to a vehicle with a trailer. It's going to be a single vehicle with a gross vehicle weight rating of 26,000 pounds or more. That would include fire trucks, dump trucks, etc., but again, large school buses. It talks about endorsements. Again, if you're going to drive one of those larger buses, you're going to have a P and S endorsement. And it talks about restrictions. If you are going to drive a bus that has air brakes on it, you cannot have a restriction on there that says that you can't drive a bus with air brakes. If you're going to drive a bus that has a manual transmission, you cannot have a restriction on there that says that you're limited to an automatic transmission only. Oftentimes refer to the air brakes as an air brake endorsement. It's not an endorsement, it's a lack of restriction if you are certified to drive a vehicle with air brakes. And motor vehicle records also have to be checked. Again, that usually goes through the Department of Driver Services. They have in place a means by which motor vehicle records are kept and can be accessed by individuals as well as organizations like ours. And there must be a notice of issuance. The issuance date is a part of the contents of the license as well. And the expiration date of the license is going to be on there. And, of course, Department of Driver Services has the renewal process for getting the license renewed. Questions? What are the endorsements required to drive a school bus? Again, we're not talking about restrictions. We're talking about the endorsements here. The answer is you have to have a passenger endorsement, a P endorsement, because you're going to have 16 or more people on that bus. And you must have the S endorsement to drive the school bus specifically. Are there standard requirements for school buses? Yes, they must meet equipment and identification standards. Again, when you're loading and unloading students in the neighborhood, there is certain equipment that must be operating. And of course, in order for it to operate, it has to be installed. So that's where the equipment and identification standards come into play. Okay, let's talk about the law regarding railroad crossings. Railroads require school buses to stop at all railroad crossings, whether the bus has students on it or not. Simple way of putting this in the law. You are required to stop at all bus stops, whether you have students on the bus or not. Procedures are basically outlined in the Commercial Driver's Manual for how we are to do that. It talks about the stopping distance, which must be at least 15 feet away from the nearest rail, but no farther than 50 feet away from the nearest rail. It says once you have come to a complete stop and you're then accelerating away from that stop and crossing over, you are not to shift gears. If you have an automatic transmission, basically you just need to make sure it's in drive. Whether the transmission shifts gears on its own is not the concern. If you have an automatic transmission, just make sure you have it in drive before you start to accelerate away. And again, if you have a manual transmission, though, typically you're going to put it in first gear, leave it in first gear until you have cleared over on the other side of the track. There are some occasions when the stop is not required. Basically, if there is emergency personnel, firefighters, police officers, etc., or flagmen employed by the railroad company, saying that you do not need to stop. If they're standing out there waving you on, then you do not need to come to a complete stop, open the door, check, wait, etc. You can go ahead and cautiously proceed as they wave you on. If the track is abandoned completely, or if the track has a sign right by it that says that it is an exempt track, then again, you don't need to go through the whole drill of stopping. Those are going to be fairly rare. Most tracks out there you're going to want to presume to be active tracks. Therefore, whether you have students or not, you want to come to the complete stop 15 to 50 feet away from the nearest rail. Check to make sure it's clear before you proceed on. Okay, speed limits. We are subject to some unique laws when transporting students on the bus. When you're out on public roads, and simply put, this is anything other than an interstate, and you have students on the bus, you are not to travel more than 40 miles an hour. There is an exception to that, which is express runs. An express run would again be an activity run, a field trip. It's got various terms for it. So you're typically going from a school loading zone directly to another school loading zone. Or you may be going from a school loading zone to a park or a museum or something, and you're unloading the students in a parking lot off the road right by this designated location. What that means is that you're not activating your loading lights when you're loading or unloading students. So if you're transporting students on an express run of that type where you do not have to be activating your loading lights when you're loading or unloading the students, then you may travel up to 55 miles an hour when you have the students on the bus. So let's just review this real quick. And I will also, let's talk about the exemption here. The exemption to the 40-mile-an-hour rule is when you're on an interstate highway. So it's designated as the Dwight D. Eisenhower system of roadways, otherwise known as the interstate. So Interstate 75, Interstate 85, Interstate 20, Interstate 16, whatever. And of course I-285 is included in that as well. When you are transporting students on the interstate highway, you may go up to 55 miles an hour. You're basically dealing with two speeds when you've got students on the bus. You're dealing with 40 miles an hour and you're dealing with 55 miles an hour. And basically the way we really encourage you to think of it is it's 40 miles an hour unless you've got some specific exceptions, unless your trip falls under some specific exceptions. When you're transporting students and you're delivering them from the school to their homes in the neighborhood, so you have to be activating the loading lights, etc. If you're on any road other than an interstate, you must be going no more than 40 miles an hour. If you are transporting students from the school to their home and you're going to be using the loading lights to either load them or unload them, but you happen to be on the interstate for a very brief period of time, in that little stretch of time, then you can go 55 miles an hour. Again, the other exception to the 40-mile-an-hour rule is if it is a field trip. You're not going to be transporting students to their home. You're not going to be activating the loading lights. It's just from one parking lot to another parking lot and back. In that case, you may go up to 55 miles an hour. And let me also specify some key language to this. You may travel the posted speed limit not to exceed. So it's the posted speed limit not to exceed 40 miles an hour. So if the speed limit in the subdivision is 25 miles an hour and you're dropping students off in that subdivision, you may go up to 25 miles an hour. That's okay. If you're driving on a kind of a secondary road with a speed limit of 35 and you've got students on the bus, again, it is okay for you to drive 35 miles an hour. But if you're on a road with a 45 mile an hour speed limit and you are transporting students to and from their home, you are not to exceed 40 miles an hour. Similarly, on the interstate, posted speed limit may be 70. You're limited to 55. If the posted speed limit in a particular stretch is less than 55, you are not to exceed the posted speed limit. So all these rules relate to posted speed limit not to exceed. That's the general language there. Again, the key one for you to remember is that 40 mile an hour speed limit. And if in doubt as to whether or not you can go faster, stay at 40 miles an hour. You're not going to be in violation. Headlights. Basically, the law says that when you are transporting students, your headlights must be in operation. Most buses are equipped with daytime running lamps so that when the engine is running and you're traveling down the road, the headlights will come on automatically. So that's going to ensure that you're in compliance to the law. However, are going to be trained to turn the headlights on, because when you turn the headlights on, you also turn on your tail lights, and in most buses, you are also turning on your clearance lamps. So we really want you lit up as best you can, but by law, when transporting students, your headlights must be in use. Therefore, if your headlights are not working, if you have no headlights at all, you are not to use that bus for transporting students. The law, that same provision of the law that requires that the headlights be in use when you're transporting students, also require that you have a communication system on the bus that enables you to communicate back with the base. Most school districts, in order to ensure that their drivers have that means of communication, will install communication equipment on there. That communication equipment is becoming more and more like a cell phone type technology, but nonetheless, it is required. So the law doesn't require that the school district install that. If you've got a cell phone, that's okay. But again, School districts do not want to simply count on whether or not the drivers have a cell phone and whether or not the cell phone works, et cetera, et cetera. We're going to typically install that equipment on there to make sure that you do have the ability to communicate with the base in the event of an emergency situation. Okay, visual signals. This body of law talks really about when you're not to use your 8-way loading system. And you're not to use them when you are loading or unloading in a school loading zone. And generally, anytime that you're loading students off the roadway, you're not to use them. So again, I've mentioned this before. If you're in a parking lot at a museum, or maybe you're taking students to a track meet that's located in a park or something like that, you're actually in a parking lot off the roadway, you're not to use the 8-ways at that point. The other time when you're not to use the 8-ways is if you are within 30 feet of an intersection that is controlled by a traffic control signal or a police officer. Most of our routes are designed in such a way that you're not going to be loading and unloading students at an intersection where there is a traffic light. But on those rare occasions when we really don't have much of a choice but to do that, the bus has to be back from or beyond the intersection so that it is no closer than 30 feet to the intersection in order to do that. So again, this provision of the law is primarily talking about prohibited usage. Usage of the 8-ways is prohibited when you're off of the roadway, and it's also prohibited when you are near a traffic control device. And we're talking traffic light now, a flashing light as well as a regular traffic light. Or if there is a police officer there guiding traffic, the 8-ways are not to be used. You need to back away from that intersection if you're going to be using your lights and stop arm, etc. Okay, what are the procedures for crossing railroad tracks? And you must stop 15 to 50 feet from the nearest rail. Listen and look in both directions. Proceed when it is safe to do so. What are the proper speeds for the route bus, express bus, interstate, and an empty bus? When you're on the route bus transporting students on a regular route, again, this is where by law you would have to be activating your loading lights when you're either loading or unloading. You may travel the posted speed limit not to exceed 40. When you're on an express run, a field trip if you will, you're not activating the loading lights, then you can go the posted speed limit not to exceed 55. When you're on the interstate highway, whether it's a route or an express run, it doesn't matter. When you're on the interstate highway, you may travel the posted speed limit not to exceed 55 miles an hour. If the bus is unloaded, you have no students, you may go the posted speed limit not to exceed 55. Now, one of the things that I want to do and make sure that you understand is that school districts themselves may have different speed limit requirements, and that is allowed as long as their speed limit, the local school district speed limit, would be in compliance to the state law. Simply put, a lot of school districts might say when you're on the interstate and you're transporting students, we don't want you to go more than 50 miles an hour. Or if you're driving on an express run, you're driving on a field trip, we don't want you to go more than 50 miles an hour. So that 50 mile an hour limit is less than the 55 mile an hour limit. Again, it would be allowed by law. So we're talking about the law requirements here. Again, do be aware that local school districts may have more stringent requirements, and they are allowed to impose those more restrictive requirements onto their drivers. When do you use 8-way lights and headlights? 8-ways are used when stopped on the highway for the purpose of receiving or discharging school students only. It is unlawful to operate any school bus which is transporting students unless the headlights are on. So you must have those things in operation. And there's other equipment that you have to have in operation when you're loading and unloading students as well. We'll get into that in just a bit. Okay, reporting violations. So this law talks about how a driver or how a school district would go about reporting stop arm violations. But of course, in order to report the violation, you first of all have to define what the violation is. So that's what this code does primarily, is it lets all motorists know when they must stop and when it would be okay. All right, so for stop arm violations, if you are traveling on a road, no matter how many lanes it has, and there is no type of physical separation between you and the direction that you're traveling and people coming from the other direction, there's no physical separation between you and oncoming traffic, then the traffic from all directions, from both directions, must come to a complete stop before they get up to where the bus is. If you are traveling and unloading on a divided highway so that there is a grass median or a raised concrete barrier or something of that type, a raised concrete curb, if there's some sort of a physical barrier between you and oncoming traffic, then only the traffic that is traveling in the same direction of you, that is to say the cars that are behind you, must stop. But the traffic coming from the other direction does not need to. Okay, so that provision in the law is in this code, defines what a stopping violation is. Again, whenever you stop your bus, anybody that's traveling in the same direction coming up from behind you, they must stop. It doesn't matter what kind of roadway you're on. If there is no physical barrier between you and oncoming traffic, then the oncoming traffic must also stop. If there is a physical barrier, and it can be a grass median or, again, some sort of raised sidewalk or something like that, then the traffic coming from the other direction does not need to stop. What happens if somebody stops, runs that violation? Well, again, there's means by which you can report that. There's specified reporting systems. I'll make this real simple. Go with what your school district says. If the school district says, give us the information and we'll forward it on, then that's what you do. Generally, the thing that I want to have you understand about that is you need to train your students. You need to stay focused on what you're doing and what your students are doing, and try to make sure that the loading and the unloading is such that it's going to be safe. You cannot control how other motorists behave. And generally, you're going to pop that stop sign out. You want to keep the door closed, keep the students on the bus until you are sure that those who need to stop are in fact going to stop before you allow your students to disembark, or in the case of the morning, before the students approach the bus. Again, you want to make sure that all traffic is stopped before that. So don't be distracted trying to get vehicle descriptions and license plates and things like that. You want to stay focused on the task at hand of loading and unloading students and take control of that which you can control, which includes your communication and your instruction to your students on safe procedure. Disembarking, this section of the law says that the motorists, once they have come to a complete stop, must remain stopped until all of the students at that stop have cleared away. And if a motorist is to proceed, tries to proceed when the area is not completely cleared and the children are not off the roadway, they would be guilty of a misdemeanor. Operation of the school bus. This is really a key law. This is a key section. It goes into detail as to what school bus drivers must do and which equipment must be activated when you're loading and unloading students. First of all, it says that all drivers shall check their mirrors as they approach the stop. They'll check their mirrors before you actually open the door to allow the students to get off or get on. You're always going to want to be checking your mirrors then before you pull out into traffic. The law dictates that drivers shall check their mirrors when loading or unloading students. It says that whenever you are loading or unloading students, you are to engage the parking brake. It is required by law that you set the parking brake whenever you load or unload students. You must display the stop arm. I would use the term stop sign. The stop sign on the left side of the bus must be extended out. Lights must be flashing. That must be displayed throughout the entire loading procedure. Again, basically, when the parking brake is set, that stop arm generally is going to be out as well. The law says that when loading and unloading, there is to be no external communication between the driver and anybody else. When actively loading or unloading, you're not to use the two-way radio. You're not to use the device that is provided to you by the school district to contact base. If the dispatch office is trying to contact you at that moment that you're loading and unloading, you are to ignore it. Keep your focus on the process of those students getting on and off and making sure that they're cleared out of the roadway. When it comes to the use of a personal cell phone, that is prohibited whenever the bus is in operation. Okay, so we do differentiate between two pieces of equipment here. Your personal cell phone is not to be used basically when you're driving the bus. That's the simple way to put it. Do not use your personal cell phone when driving the bus. You may use the two-way radio when you're not actively loading and unloading the students. Okay, but key here, whenever you're loading or unloading, again, your focus must be precisely on the process at hand. Do not allow yourself to be distracted by communication to people that are not on the bus. Crossing the roadway. There are really two key provisions here, in my opinion. The law says that the driver is obligated to provide safe instruction to the students on how to load and unload and cross, including crossing in front of the bus. So really, the key that we talk about here is that this part of the law says that when students cross the street, they must do so in front of the bus. That's specified there. If a parent ever says, why do you have my child crossing in front of the bus, because their intuition tells them that that's dangerous, it's because the law says so. And the reason the law says so is because it's not dangerous. It's the safest way to do that. So that is specified in law, that they must cross in front of the bus. However, there is this provision in this part of the law that says that the driver is obligated to provide training to the students. And among that training, or included in that training, is that when they do cross, it's in front of the bus. That is something to be aware of. You do have an obligation to provide reasonable instruction to your students on the safe loading and unloading procedures. And finally, the provision in the law says that the 8-way light system must be used. So your 8-way flashers must be operating when you're loading and unloading students, and as a part of that, the crossing gate must also be out. So let's kind of review. This law says that, again, certain pieces of equipment must be on your bus and they must be operational, and you must be using them when you're loading and unloading students. We talked about before, your headlights have to be working, and in this provision of the law, your parking brake must be working and it must be set. Your stop sign must be working and it must be deployed. Your 8-way loading lights, amber and red loading lights, must operate and they must be used. And your crossing gate must be operational and you must use them. So if any of those pieces of equipment are not operational, then that bus is not to be used to transport students. Identification, again, the law talks about what kind of equipment has to be on the bus. That National School Bus chrome yellow is a part of the color. You have the words school bus, black lettering located above the driver's windshield. It's also located in the back above the emergency exit door. All of those little things that identify what a bus is and make it appear unique, all of those things are specified in law. And again, the equipment must be there and must be operational. And again, provisions for the school district to make sure that the specifications are in compliance. Okay, as we continue on, again, there are standards that are applicable, specified in state law, basically carrying over from federal law, and the operations of the school bus, those kinds of things are all specified in state law. If you've ever been from one state to another, you know that school buses pretty much all look the same. It's because federal law will dictate a lot of that, and again, the states, though, create their own laws to come into compliance to the federal laws. Okay, inspections of school buses. The Department of Driver Services, again, as a division of the State Department of Public Safety, is responsible for making sure that the vehicles are roadworthy. So they do an annual inspection, but then there's also other things that are required there. So the annual inspection is actually done by the Department of Driver Services, required by law. It specifies what they must do, what they have to be inspecting, and of course it requires that the school districts make all their buses available for inspection. When a vehicle has passed inspection, it is given a certification of the inspection. If it doesn't pass, it is taken immediately out of operation until such time that the defect is repaired or addressed, and it is then able to pass inspection. There are no school buses that are exempt from that annual certification process. Just penalties, violations of various articles would be considered misdemeanors. Okay, why is it important for our mirrors to be adjusted properly? To ensure that it is safe to place the bus in motion. So again, by law, you must be checking the mirrors. You need to check it on your approach. You need to also check those mirrors before you pull away from a bus stop and come back into traffic. So the mirrors have to be adjusted properly so you can make sure you see what you need to see. Why do you set the parking brake at the bus stop? To assure that the bus does not move while loading and unloading. And again, remember, it's the law. Okay, why is it important to display the stop arm? To stop any oncoming traffic for student safety. Again, I guarantee you, it's hard enough to get people to stop if you when you do have that stop arm out. If you don't put that out there, they're not going to stop. So it's very important that you be conscious of that. Make sure that it's out there. Make sure that the traffic then does stop before you release the students. Is it lawful to operate a cell phone or a two-way radio while loading or unloading? Absolutely not. Why? Because your attention must remain on the students loading and unloading. Should a student cross behind a school bus? Again, absolutely not. All students must cross to the front. Again, it is required by law. Students must cross in a manner that allows the driver to maintain visual contact. All right, summary of the Georgia traffic laws. And again, 40 code is the Georgia traffic laws. They go over state vehicle registration. We've talked about CDL licensing, railroad crossing, speed limits, the use of headlights. When loading and unloading students, the headlights must be working. Prohibited use of the visual signals. Again, you cannot use them within 30 feet of an intersection that has a traffic signal or a police officer controlling traffic, and you're not to use them off the roadway. Reporting violations of stop arms, and again, what is a stop arm violation? Continuing our summary of 40 code here, traffic laws, the operation of the school bus. Again, check the mirrors, make sure your parking brake is set, make sure your stop sign is deployed, make sure you are not using any communication equipment, that your focus is entirely on the students there getting on and off. Make sure that the students are crossing in front of the bus. Make sure that your 8-way loading lights are working and the crossing gate is deployed as well. So that all comes under that law there, specific operation of the school bus. The standard equipment requirements, we've talked about that. Again, the lettering of the word school bus, the color, the painting, all of that kind of thing. Special route services and unlawful acts, and reporting those and the punishment for that. We've talked about the state inspection. The state will do their inspection once a year. Every bus operated by every school system in the state of Georgia is going to be inspected once a year before it's put out on the road, or in order to be allowed to stay out on the road. And we've talked real briefly about violations of that. Okay, let's move on to this last area of regulation. This is the 160 code. Again, these are rules written by the Department of Education, usually under the direction of the General Assembly. So the General Assembly, as I said, will say the Department of Education must promulgate regulations to ensure. The General Assembly doesn't write it. It's up to the Department of Education to do it. But when they do write those regulations, they are then published. It's considered 160 area of the law code, and again, it has the effect of law. It is as if the General Assembly debated it, voted on it, passed it, and the governor signed off on it. Kinds of things that we talk about here: purchase of the buses, contracted services, inspection, insurance, school bus drivers, student surveys, cost development, student safety, fuels and explosives, alcohol and drug testing. Why are these Board of Education rules and policies important? To understand the requirements to be a driver, to understand the importance of bus inspections, to understanding where funding comes from to maintain the buses, purchasing, insurance, etc., to understand how to maintain student safety, so things like fuels and explosives, and to understand the need of alcohol and drug testing. Let's start with purchasing and contracting. Again, not a lot of details that as drivers we need to know about. It does specify the equipment necessary on a bus. It talks about how to go about getting bids. There is a system that the state operates that the local school districts can use to help purchase buses, et cetera, et cetera. The law talks about contracted services. So again, remember we were talking about that 20 code earlier. These are more specific regulations relating to the rules and the obligations under the 20 code. So that's what that is. Again, we're not going to ask you questions on that. As bus drivers, we really don't have to concern ourselves with that. But do be aware that the school districts must be focused on that and concerned about it. School bus inspections. The Department of Motor Vehicle Services, that's what it was called originally back when this law was originally passed. There's been some restructuring. It's now called the Department of Driver Services, or DDS, has to come out and do it annually. It also requires that school systems themselves engage in monthly inspection. Now, the requirement there is that it be done. How does the state know that it's done? Well, if they come out and look, there should be records of it being done. So, and typically when they come out to do the annual inspection of the buses themselves, they'll also check paperwork and make sure that the monthly maintenance is taking place as well. School bus insurance, again, maintain a minimum liability coverage. Other insurance regulations would be in there as well. Okay, question. How often do local service personnel inspect the school bus? This would be the maintenance department. That's what we're talking about when we talk about service personnel, not the drivers. How often do the local service personnel inspect the bus? Monthly. Okay, what type of insurance coverage is required to be maintained? Among others, there's a minimum liability coverage that has to be there. There's all kinds of other insurance coverages that a school district is going to want to have, but there is a minimum liability requirement as well. Okay, school bus drivers. This gets into the licensing requirement, whether or not they're resident or non-resident. As a rule, in order to get a license in the state of Georgia, you're going to have to be a resident of the state of Georgia. It does allow for provisions where, you've got somebody that lives in Alabama that's driving in Columbus or something like that. Certainly that's allowable, and there's got to be provisions there to allow for that. It differentiates between defining what a regular and substitute driver is. There's some definition of what a trainer is. Now we do have what some school districts refer to as a certified instructor trainer. They are authorized to conduct this state training class. I had to go through this training in order for me to be able to do this class. So that's now in the code as well. And the requirements for all these different types of things, again, are laid out in this code here. Basically, minimum of age 18 in order to be a driver. Again, the rules for getting a CDL is that they must be a minimum of age 18. They must take and pass an annual physical, so the school districts have to do that. They must, of course, have that CDL with a P&S endorsement. Board of Education regulations get into salaries for employees. Again, there's basically 12 months. Generally, most school systems have 180 days of school, and some school districts, some employees, school bus drivers typically are going to work an extra day or so beyond just the school days, because they're coming in usually pre-planning week. They're usually coming in a few days before school starts in most school districts to get their route assignments, check out their buses, get some basic training. A lot of times the annual training is done during that pre-planning period. So again, whatever the number of days is in the contract year, that must be specified. Again, all employees of school districts, including school bus drivers, must be given sick and personal leave. It talks about substitute pay, that type of thing. Again, continuing on with continuing education, you must have 24 hours of certified training. So by certification, the state is going to have specified what is done, and then it's got to be documented. So the 24 hours of certified training includes the 12 hours of state classroom, a minimum of 6 hours driving an empty bus with a certified trainer, and a minimum of 6 hours driving a bus with students with a trainer. It talks about the annual in-service training. Again, the Department of Education comes around to all school districts throughout the state at least once a year, every year, to update us on the laws and common practices and issues. All drivers are required by law to report any accidents that they're involved in involving a school bus. Again, the school district then must report that up as well, so there's requirements on that as well. Student surveys. Now, you remember when we were initially talking about 20 code, I talked about when the state dictates that certain services be required by the local school districts, that the state will also require funding. And I've talked about how the state provides money for salaries and sick time and all of that other kind of stuff. Well, how does the state know how much funding it needs to provide back to each and every school district? Well, it asks the school district to provide them with that information. It's commonly known as student surveys. Now, we're not asking the students anything. What we're doing is we're asking the school districts to tell us about the number of students that they have and that type of thing. In order for the school districts to have the information that they need to send up to the state, they need the drivers to help them gather that information. So we do what is commonly known as student surveys. They're typically done in March, the spring of the year. And these student surveys help us determine need, help us determine cost. They focus in on safety issues, how we can improve service, and generally go over the efficient operation of the buses and the system in general. So the regulations put out by the Department of Education that they are then required to enforce puts an obligation onto the local school districts, which is ultimately sent down to the drivers, to gather some information, provide that back to the school district. Okay, define a school bus driver. A person appropriately licensed who controls the operation of a school bus. What are the licensing requirements for school bus drivers? What's the minimum age and what's the endorsements? The answer is they must have a minimum age of 18. So an 18 or 19-year-old can drive a bus. Okay, they must be minimum of age 18. They must have P&S endorsements on their commercial driver's license. Who pays the sub-driver? The local school district, but again, they can get some reimbursement perhaps from the state. But it is the obligation of the local school district to pay all of their employees. Okay, how much training is required to become a school bus driver? 24 hours total, minimum. Simply put, 12 hours in a class, 12 hours on the road. And again, that 12 hours is on the road is divided into 6 hours empty and 6 hours with students. Okay, continuing on with some of these regulations. Standard cost development. Again, this is what local school districts have to look at in considering what their costs are. And again, the state might provide some reimbursement. They have to look at the salary. They have to look at the pension plans that are provided. They have to look at sick leave. They have to look at the need to provide a required medical exam, drug and alcohol testing, et cetera, et cetera. So those are the kinds of things to consider in cost development. School bus insurance, cost and coverage information has to be made available. Bus replacement funds, bus shop construction, and of course all their employees, the equipment, and all of that within the maintenance garages. Operating funds, so this is fuel, that type of thing, determine cost per miles. Routes are measured every school year. Extended mileage when used beyond the required time and mileage. So what the state reimburses for is from the first pickup to when they're dropped off at school. They don't necessarily pay us for the miles from where the bus is parked to get to the first pickup, for instance, or in the morning after you've dropped off to the last school, the miles that the bus drives to get back to its park location. That's not necessarily going to be reimbursed by the state. So the local school district has to be aware of what that cost is going to be, and they have to be prepared to pay it. Okay, let's talk about the regulation that relates to aspects of student safety. There are 3 provisions in this law, and they might appear to not be really one related to the other, but nonetheless, all of them do relate to things that the school district needs to keep in mind and comply to in order to help ensure student safety. The first one we've talked about before when we talked about the 20 code is a requirement to do an annual emergency evacuation training for the students. So we have to do an evacuation drill. It's done at the schools, typically done in the morning, and it has to be documented. So the law does require a minimum of one emergency evacuation drill per year. Most school districts will do 2 of them. No speakers in the driver's compartment. Those school districts that are in the major metropolitan areas have a tendency not to have these speakers. It's more the rural school buses where the buses stop at a house out in the middle of the country, and all the students that live in that house get on the bus. So you're transporting elementary, middle school, and high school all on the same loads. And the kids that get on the bus at first are going to be on that bus potentially for a long time. So it's not unusual in those school districts to install some type of a music system. So there might be an AM/FM radio up front. They might even have the ability to have cassette tapes or MP3 players or whatever, so that they can play recorded music as well. And it would make sense, as these students are on that bus for a long time, that they might be able to listen to radio station, news radio, or something like that. The key to that is, of course, if they've got this, there's going to be speakers for the kids to hear that. And this law just says that if you've got that type of a system installed on the bus, you cannot have a speaker up in the driver's compartment. This law was passed a good 15 years ago, right around the early 2000s. There were some buses that had those speakers up there before this law was passed. When this law was passed, those speakers had to be immediately disconnected. And again, any new bus ordered since that time, there are to be no speakers in the driver's compartment. So we don't have that noise factor. You don't have that distraction. The drivers are able to see and hear and stay focused better as they're taking that bus down the road. Load limits. The law says that we can transport 20% more than the rated capacity. Okay, so most big conventional buses, a conventional school bus is one that has the big hood out front. Most big conventional buses will have a rated capacity of 72 students. That's 3 to a seat. There's 12 rows, 2 benches per row, 24 benches times 3 to a seat. That's 72. The law says that we can carry 20% more than that. That's approximately another 14 students. So the law would say in a 72 capacity bus, we could have as many as 86 students on the bus. Now, that's not something we want to do. It's very crowded. It's undesirable. But it does give us that, and we would use it primarily in an emergency situation. So let's say this would probably be more of metropolitan area type buses. You've got a bus going into a neighborhood, and the neighborhood has enough students riding on it that it takes 2 buses, and each bus would have about 40 students on it. So that's comfortable, no problem. That's a good number to have, but let's say one of those buses breaks down, and it's cold, and it's raining. And so rather than having to have those students wait outside for us to get another bus to the broken down bus, what we might do is just have the other bus that's in the neighborhood come by and pick up the students for the broken down bus. As a result of that, what happens is you end up putting 80 students on this bus that is designed for 72. That's okay. The law allows that to happen. So in that case, you get the kids on the bus, you get them to school safely, you get them out of the rain, et cetera, et cetera. Other examples might be a bus that's broken down on the roadway and it's kind of in a dangerous situation. Again, if we've got another bus that's going by, may already have some students on it. When you combine the loads, it may exceed 72, but not by much. So again, the law will allow in this temporary situation to go ahead and load them up. So the law doesn't specify that it has to be permanent or temporary. It does give us the capacity to go beyond that load, but most school districts are only going to use that in an exceptional or an emergency type situation, but it does give us the flexibility to do something in that situation. Fuels and explosives. Basically, they're not to be transported. Firearms. Only law enforcement officials who are certified by the state may have weapons on a school bus. Now, most school districts will have their own police officers. That's not unusual. They're typically referred to as school resource officers, or SROs. An SRO is licensed by the state to carry a firearm on a school bus. They're basically police officers. They're just employed by the school system rather than a local police agency. So they are allowed to do that. Again, only law enforcement personnel may have weapons on a school bus. And when it comes to fueling the buses, there is not to be a student on the bus while the bus is being fueled. Alcohol and controlled substance testing, again, federal law dictates this, but we have to have laws down at the state level. Local boards of education, etc., have to have these regulations in order to make sure that they're in compliance. So these are rules that have to be in writing, in essence, to make sure that we're in compliance to the federal law. Okay, so all employees with a commercial driver's license are subject to alcohol and controlled substance testing. The local board of education has to adopt a policy on the testing. Okay, some study questions here. What are the 3 ways to assure student safety? Emergency evacuation training, no speakers located in the driver's compartment, and load limits. Can fuels be carried on a school bus? No. So you'll have fuels in the fuel tank, but if a student tries to get on carrying a gallon of gasoline or diesel fuel, no. So fuels cannot be carried on the bus. Why? You've got a danger of explosion. You also have the possibility for inhalation of those fumes by students. Who is allowed to carry a gun on a school bus? Only law enforcement or school officials authorized by law may have weapons on a public school bus. Who can be tested for drugs and alcohol? All employees with a commercial driver's license. All right, so let's just do a summary of these Board of Education rules. Again, the 160 codes. It gets into regulations on purchasing of the buses, contracted services, bus inspection, insurance coverage, the driver requirements, again, minimum age 18 with the P&S endorsements, the transportation surveys, so this is the local school districts providing information to the state board for funding purposes, etc. Cost development, layout for all the things that the local school districts have to consider when putting together their budgets. Student safety, that is the annual evacuation drills, no speakers in the driver's compartment, and load limits not to exceed more than 20% above the rated capacity. Fuels and explosives, again, the only people allowed to carry a firearm on a bus are law enforcement and school personnel authorized by law. Alcohol and drug testing, anybody that holds a commercial driver's license by federal law is subject to alcohol and drug testing, and again, the local board of education must have drug and alcohol testing policies in place. How do you apply this training? Practice obeying the laws daily to assure safety. Know what your local school districts are to help make you a better employee. What's our standard for measuring your performance? You should be able to correctly answer the questions pertaining to state laws and Board of Education laws and traffic laws for the operation of school buses. We have completed Unit 1. We're now going to be talking about Unit 2 from the Georgia Department of Education mandated training for school bus drivers. This unit is on traffic control devices. Our objectives are to understand the colors, shapes, symbols, and messages on traffic signs, to identify the meaning of traffic signals, to identify the standard roadway markers, and understand the meaning of the colors in road delineators. Performance standards, you should be able to identify the meaning of standard colors, shapes, symbols, and messages used on traffic signs, identify the meaning of standard traffic signals and roadway markings, and know the colors in road delineators. And just as an overview, we're going to have these 3 general topics. We're going to talk about the traffic signs, we're going to talk about the traffic signals, those are flashing lights of some sort, and the roadway markings themselves. Why is this important? Signs, signals, and roadway markings are the way that every road communicates with us about the safe use of that road. And of course, learning to read the language of the road signs, signals, and markings will help you share the road sensibly and stay safer. Colors are recognized long before the pictorial is recognized or message read. So again, as you're approaching and you see a sign in the distance, it is the color that will help you understand the nature of what that sign is. So as you get closer, you can anticipate what it will say. Learning the traffic sign's colors helps you share the road sensibly and stay safer. And we are going to focus on 8 standard colors here today: red, green, blue, yellow, black, white, orange, and brown. Again, the key here is we are looking at 8 standard colors. Okay, the first one is red. It means stop or prohibited. And again, you see here as an example a wrong way sign. Now, of course, we all associate red with a stop sign, but it also talks about prohibition too. So the wrong way sign is an example of a prohibition that's going to be colored red. The green signs indicates movement, permitted, or direction guidance, and the most standard one is a directional guidance one. You see here, you'll see these along the side of the interstate, of course, where it gives you information about mileage ahead to various towns, etc. So it's giving you information, giving you direction and guidance. Blue is motorist service guidance. Most standard one would be an evacuation route. Yellow is general warning. Very common sign, and it's always going to be associated with a diamond shape. We'll talk about shapes in a bit, but again, the warning signs are going to be yellow. Yellow is indicative of general warning. Black and white tells us about regulation. So the most standard of that is speed limit. You also see here as an example a black and white sign that says one way. So these are regulations. These are telling you about the law and specifically legal directions that you have to have as you're driving. The orange signs are used in construction and maintenance. Again, any sign that would be located within a construction zone is going to be orange in its color. It may be a speed limit sign. It may have different shapes. It may have different information, but as long as you're in the construction zone, it's going to be orange in color. Brown is public recreation and scenic guidance. So here we have an example of a sign pointing you toward a museum. The most common colors used in traffic signs are, as I said, these 8 colors: red, green, blue, yellow, black, white, orange, and brown. The color of the sign, again, can be recognized long before the pictorial can be recognized or the message read. Let's look at standard shapes, and again, we're going to focus on 8 standard shapes. And they are the octagon, which you already know is the stop sign, the horizontal rectangle, diamond, pentagon, pennant, vertical rectangle, equilateral triangle, and the round shape. And again, the octagon is a stop sign, and it will almost always be red. The exception would be perhaps if it's in a construction zone, it might be orange, but for the most part, even in a construction zone, the octagon is always going to be red. It is uniquely the stop sign. The horizontal rectangle is, again, guidance information. So earlier we showed an example of a green sign that showed guidance information. That was on a horizontal rectangle. It doesn't necessarily have to be green in color. Here you see that it's black and white for a divided highway, but the horizontal rectangle is, again, going to give you guidance information. Diamond is the general warning, and as I mentioned before, almost always the general warning sign is going to be diamond-shaped and almost always yellow in color. The one exception would be is if that is in a construction zone. So the diamond-shaped and the yellow color go together as warning signs. The pentagon, that's the one that tells us about school warning. They are a unique color, relatively new. It's a fluorescent green, yellow. Here you see the sign showing as a school zone area. Usually associated with that is a reduced speed limit. If it has 2 parallel lines walking across where the feet of the students are, that would indicate a crosswalk located at a school. Again, the pentagon sign, that 5-shaped house-looking sign, is always going to be associated with the school. The pennant, again, unique and almost always associated with no passing. It is always associated with no passing, usually always yellow in color. Again, the pennant shape, a triangle, a long triangle on its side, is the no passing zone. And the vertical rectangle is usually the regulatory, except for the stop and yield. So speed limit, again, that color black and white is usually going to be found on the vertical rectangle. The equilateral triangle, again, a unique shape, and it is yield. And you'll notice it's got a little bit of the red in there, but not solid red. So remember, red is prohibitive. Yield sign is kind of unusual. Slow down. Be prepared to stop. So it is a red and white color. Again, it's always going to be that equilateral triangle shape. Round is another one that's near and dear to us that we need to recognize, and that's the advance warning of the railroad crossing. And we're going to talk about this a lot. Railroad crossing, it means that bus is usually going to be stopping before the railroad crossing, so it's important that you're aware and conscious and looking for these round signs. Round signs always are an indication of railroad crossing. A few study questions on this. The standard shapes are octagon, horizontal rectangle, diamond, pentagon, pennant, vertical rectangle, equilateral triangle, and round. And again, if you count the number of shapes listed here, you'll notice it's 8. That's what we're focused on. Yes, that is correct. Classification of road signs, we generally have regulatory signs. It informs us of laws and regulations. Again, generally those are black and white, and it's going to be on the vertical rectangle. Warning signs informs us of situations requiring extra care. Typically, it's yellow in color and diamond in shape. Guide signs inform us of routes, directs us to destination. Generally, those are going to be horizontal rectangles, and they will usually either be green or black on white. So, name the two standards for traffic signs: A, size; B, shape; C, color; D, B, and C. And the correct answer to that is D, B, and C. The standards are the shape and color. Sizes might vary a little bit, but the standards are shape and color. Let's look at traffic signals, and again, these are lights that we're talking about here. Red. Red means stop. It's that simple. Whether it's flashing or solid, you're going to stop. Yellow is caution. Green means proceed with caution. Green does not mean go. Green means proceed with caution. The green arrow means proceed with caution in the direction of the arrow. Again, flashing red means remain stopped until it is safe. So you will stop. You then may proceed, but you must make sure that it's safe before you do so. Flashing yellow is an indication of a warning of a hazardous location. You do not necessarily need to stop, but certainly slow down and be aware of a potential hazard. True or false? A red light means stop, a yellow means caution, and a green means go! Exclamation point. That is false. A green light means proceed with caution. Does the law prohibit commercial motor vehicles from making a right turn on red? The answer to that is no. A right turn on red is allowed unless a sign or your school district prohibits it. So please be aware of that. Many school districts will say no right turn on red, but there is no special law. The law does allow it, but be aware that the school district policy may prohibit it or limit it in certain ways. And of course, the other thing is, whenever there's a sign at an intersection that says no right turn on red, of course, that would be the law for that intersection. Let's talk about roadway markings. Colors used most are yellow and white. Almost always they're going to be yellow and white. White lines indicate traffic traveling in the same direction. Yellow lines indicate traffic traveling in opposite directions. So as you look here, what you see is an exit ramp on a limited access highway. You'll notice the dashed white lines. You'll notice it delineates between two lanes, and the traffic on either side of that white line is heading in the same direction. If you look off to the left side there, though, you'll see the yellow line. There's a median on the other side, But nonetheless, when you cross over that yellow line, you are in danger of heading into traffic that is coming from the other direction. So white lines, again, traffic on either side of a white line are going in the same direction. The yellow lines will delineate between traffic coming from the opposite direction. Solid lines are restrictive, don't cross. Broken lines they do allow you to cross when traffic permits. So here you see a 2-lane road. If you're traveling in the direction that this picture was taken, you'll notice that there's a solid yellow line on that left side. So there's a prohibition there. You do not want to cross it. However, traffic coming from the other direction heading toward you, they have a dashed yellow line, a broken yellow line. They would be allowed to pass if it is safe to do so. Solid white lines mark the right edge. So you see the white line on the right side. It does mark the edge. It's solid. The idea is you don't want to cross that. Double solid yellows are a maximum restriction. You are not to cross a double solid yellow line. Always check if you don't see that white on the right on any divided highway or ramp that you enter, you're traveling the wrong way. So in this picture, you see that the white is on the left. You also see the arrow coming at you. So again, just looking at the roadway markings, colors of the lines, since that white line's on the left, you know you're heading in the wrong direction. White arrows show direction for any given lane. Let's talk about HOV lanes, high occupancy vehicles. So in a high occupancy vehicle lane, they're going to be on limited access roads, interstates typically. The traffic is always going in the same direction, and so it's going to be white lines that distinguish between lanes here. If it is a single solid line, crossing is discouraged, so you see it here as lanes merge. You'll usually get a single solid line. You should try to stay in your lane if you possibly can here. So with that, it's discouraged. Broken lines, whether it's single or double, and you see in the lower picture there are double broken lines, but the broken lines do allow you to change lanes to cross over those lines. So when the broken lines are there, you may enter and exit the HOV lane. Continuing with roadway markings on HOV lanes, if it is a solid double line, you are not to change the lanes. You're not to cross over solid double lines. So you see here in this picture, we have the solid double lines differentiating between regular traffic lanes and the HOV lanes. At that point on the roadway, you're not to be changing lanes. Once you're in the lane, you're to stay in the lane. Do not cross the solid double lines. And that is true, by the way, whether it's white or yellow. The color of the line doesn't matter. It's the fact that they're solid and the fact that it's doubled up, it's maximum restriction. Is it the law that you cannot cross double solid lines? Yes, it is. Violators will be ticketed. Are school buses allowed to travel in the high occupancy vehicle lanes since they transport 2 or more passengers? The answer to that question is no. Why? Well, there's really 2 reasons. First of all, far left lanes are for faster moving vehicles, and as we talked about in Unit 1, the law restricts school buses transporting students to go no more than 55 miles an hour. So generally, our speed limit is going to be less than what would be allowed otherwise, so we need to stay out of there. There's another reason why we don't want buses to be in the HOV lanes, and that is in case of an emergency evacuation. Remember, your exit door is always on the right side, and HOV lanes are typically always on the left. If you're in the HOV lane, if you're in the far left lane, and your bus breaks down, the only way for the students to get off that bus is to go out into a lane of traffic. So when you're traveling on the interstates, you need to be over to the right lane where slow-moving traffic goes anyway, and you also need to be in the best position to get into an emergency lane in case of a need for an evacuation. Let me clarify this. The law specifically says school buses are to stay out of the HOV lanes. So this is there's reasons for that law. The law does specify it. You're to stay out of it because the law says so. Okay, let's review what we have talked about here in Unit 2. We've talked about traffic signs. Again, the key to the traffic signs are the two standards, color and shape. The color and the shape are associated with the type of information or direction that's going to be on those signs. Traffic signals, red means stop, yellow means caution, green means proceed with caution. And the roadway markings. Again, a broken line you can cross, a single solid line you should try to avoid crossing, a double solid line, whether it's yellow or white, it doesn't matter, you are not to cross double solid lines. How do you apply this training? Use this as building blocks to refine and improve the skills that prepares you to evaluate and respond to situations in any driving environment. And our measure for this will be a continuous process, analyzing the daily driving environment to reduce accidents and to maximize safety of the students we transport. Can you imagine driving a school bus on roads, highways, or interstates with such precious cargo without the traffic signs, signals, or roadway markings? It serves a purpose. It keeps us safe. Let's all be grateful that it's out there and understand how that is to be used so that we can all operate and share the road safely.